Welcome, historians, to the final part of the fifth set of notes for Unit 6 called Expanding Civil Rights. By the time we're finished with this video today, you should have pages 12, 13, and 14 all filled in. And if you don't, that means that you have one of the Ed puzzles yet to do from last week. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. It should be pretty quick. We don't have too much more to do. We're going to move away from African American civil rights and focus on some other groups who are also struggling for social justice in the United States in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, and of course before that. So the spirit of the reform that came from this movement spread to all corners of society. More groups began to organize to achieve greater rights and protections under the law. Because remember, the 14th Amendment promised equal rights under the law for all United States citizens. And so by seeing the work that the African American community was doing to gain equal rights, other groups started to think, hey, we can do that for ourselves too. And especially seeing some of their successes. So one group that we're going to focus on is the Native American community. And in 1968, the most popular way to refer to the Native American community was American Indian. So in that era, in the 60s, a group of Minnesotans actually began to call for civil rights for American Indians and formed what is known as AIM, A-I-M, for American Indian Movement. And the idea was to seek justice for broken treaties, which we all know were many, 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 and also to celebrate traditional Native culture. They worked to help Natives living in poverty, which many of them were. And that same year, 1968, Congress passed what is known as the Indian Civil Rights Act. In 1973, so about 5 years after that, AIM, the American Indian Movement, turned to a more radical style of protest when armed members of the movement occupied the site of the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre in South Dakota. AIM wanted to remind people of the government's unfair treatment of Natives. Not everyone approved with the militant tactics, but the movement inspired Native American pride. So much like the African American movement, you kind of have the two different sides under King with the nonviolent resistance, and then under Malcolm X with and the Black Panthers with the more militant style of violent, aggressive tactics. You see that in the other groups as well, and that doesn't exclude this group, Native Americans. So they held this land in South Dakota for about, 90 days. And then the federal government kind of swooped in and kicked them out. But their point was to let the world know that, well, first of all, about just a reminder about Wounded Knee, and then also just to remind the world about all of the many, many broken treaties between the United States and American Indian tribes. In 1975, Congress expanded the civil rights that had been granted in 1968 by extending protection over Native lands and providing funding for Indian education programs in public schools. So we still have that today. Students who have Native ancestors are able to get education during the school day from a specialized teacher so that they can stay connected with their tribes and the culture, which isn't always provided in the regular curriculum. All right, so on page 13, let's go ahead and summarize a little bit of the American Indian movement. That was a very brief, but at least an introduction. So it really started in the mid-60s, of course, with that inspiration from the African American movement and its successes. And Minneapolis, it was the center point for that. And they were looking for justice for broken treaties and then also to celebrate traditional culture. Because remember, traditional culture had really been wiped away in many cases with the boarding schools that the young children had been sent to in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, 1920s. A whole generation had lost that. And so seeking that connection back to their roots, back to their culture, was a big part of this movement. In 1968, at the same time AIM began, the Indian Civil Rights Act was passed and signed by President Johnson. And then in 1972, we have the protest called the Trail of Broken Treaties, where we have a group who traveled from the West Coast to Washington, D.C. to seek protection for Native cultures and for the U.S. government to recognize tribal control of reservations. There was kind of a back and forth during the 20th century of the United States government saying, the reservation system is done, the land is available for all Americans, and then it went back the other way where the government recognized control of those reservations here in 1972. So in the meantime, tribes lost millions of acres of land just overall. In 1975, Congress passed the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act to give Native Americans control over reservations. So this provides even more control over the land, and then providing federal money for Indian education program in schools, which is what I mentioned earlier. All right. So switching gears here to a different civil rights movement, which was inspired by the larger protest movement aimed at bringing equality to Americans, was the women's movement. And the name and the face of the women's movement is a woman named Betty Friedan. You can see her in that upper picture. She's the woman with the kind of grayish colored hair there in the middle of the march. But anyway, her idea was to inspire women to seek more than just being a happy homemaker, and urging them to break out of what she called the housewife trap. She wrote books and articles, was seen on TV, organized marches. So even though many women did find satisfaction in running a home and caring for her family, there were other women who felt a little trapped by that and wanted opportunities to find fulfillment outside of the home. And so she encouraged women to do that. During the 1960s, and so this is really kind of right on the heels of that very traditional decade of the 1950s where women were at home and men went to work. So this is not shocking necessarily, but definitely going against cultural norms. But women began to kind of organize and ask for a change. Some wanted to end discrimination against women in the workplace. So, trying to get rid of those sort of traditional roles of women at work, asking for more equal pay in the workplace. Others were more interested in women's education and health opportunities, just making sure that women were provided with equal opportunities for education, especially higher education beyond high school, and then health, especially when it came to women's health and pregnancy, and making sure that all women were being treated by physicians for their needs that were specifically female. In 1966, the NOW organization was formed. It stands for the National Organization of Women, and it encouraged women to participate in American society. So again, pushing them to get out of the home and participate in the larger society. Now, women who supported this movement, it certainly wasn't everybody, became known as feminists. So I know that word has many connotations, but that is kind of the beginning of it. Let's go ahead and fill out the information for NOW, the National Organization for Women. It was the 1960s where women started to organize to oppose discrimination and opportunities and pay in the workplace and schools. And then also advocating for women's issues such as health and childcare. And that last part, childcare, all that really means is being able to find a way to leave the house, but making sure that your children were taken care of was difficult for women, still is in some cases. And what they were really looking for was for businesses to provide a way for women to be able to come to work, but have their children taken care of. And that is something that I think women still struggle with and families still struggle with today. All right, that is it. I think that you should have all of the blanks filled in for your Notes 5 in your Unit 6 packet. So I'm going to go ahead and sign off. And you have a couple of assignments to work on. You could work on the boomer assignment, interviewing a boomer. You could work on your Sounds of the Civil Rights Movement assignment. So we've got a couple different things that are a little bit more long-term. And then we will wrap up by doing Notes 6, the final set of notes of the year, here in a couple of days. Have a great one. Bye.